Well, I want to thank the School of Social Work, and particularly Professor David Takeuchi, for organizing my visit, my talk today. I'm very much appreciative of their efforts and the co-sponsorship of so many different units and organizations here at Boston College as well. And I'm truly flattered by their support, and I'm certainly appreciative of you coming out on a Monday evening to this talk. You know, I originally wanted to title my presentation, Still Racy After All These Years. But David warned me that the substance of the talk might be misconstrued and advised me to pick, in his opinion, a much more modest title. So here goes. Last year, the third edition of Racial Formation was released. And my writing partner, Howard Winan, and I saw the rewriting of the book sort of as a home remodeling project. And I say this because we certainly have a very unique collaborative relationship. And what's funny is that I imagined that we needed to change the examples, which had not which seemed kind of dated and not seem as sufficient. But also, I just wanted to move things. If a home remodeling project would be, I just want to move the furniture around, change the wallpaper a little bit. And Howie was much more intent on taking out the plumbing and tearing down some walls and working on the foundations. So in fact, we rewrote everything, every chapter, and I think for the better. And so far, it's done really well. And in fact, in an act of shameless promotion, I'm going to tell you that it was actually the #1 sociology book on Routledge Press. Now, I learned this from Eduardo Bonilla Silva. He always says, you got to promote your stuff. You got to tell them how good it is. I want to talk briefly about what's new about the new edition, and then share some thoughts about where we could be going with respect to racial theory. And I'm going to go wide and not very deep to cover a number of issues and themes, and hopefully provoke a conversation with you. But let me start with a little bit of a backstory here. And it certainly has been a long and strange trip. Our thinking about race began in the 1980s as an engagement with both prevailing social science literature and left theorizing on the subject. That's me on your right, in case you're confused. A young sociology we briefly met at the American Sociological Association once said, hey, you guys are like the Simon and Garfunkel of racial theory. Now, within the social sciences, what we were trying to critique was conceiving and operationalizing the concept of race in a very static and unproblematic way, to treat it like an independent variable and just correlate race and residential patterns, race and health disparities, race and incarceration, a whole host of things. But what was really questioned was, what was the meaning of race itself? And how did race assume a given reality, a given significance at a specific historical moment and at a specific social site? Now, on the part of the left, too, we were also kind of concerned among left framings of race as somehow the reduction of race to class, and a very narrow definition of what class meant, and the absence of what we considered to be a sufficient concept of the racial state. Now, let me tell you this, what was really striking about when we first put out Racial Formation is that we were virtually ignored by the social scientists who continued to cling to unproblematic notions of race as a kind of independent variable. And in fact, much to our surprise, our earliest fans were from other disciplines, from law, literary and cultural studies, and history, and scholars whose work really has helped to deepen, extend, and at times critically challenge the concept of racial formation. So, well, I want to acknowledge that we've learned much from the scholarship and the political practice that has creatively engaged some of the concept of racial formation and has really advanced new ways to think about the ongoing evolution of racism and its multiple dimensions. Essentially, the concept of racial formation is thinking about the social historical process of race making, not treating race as something given, objective in status, but something which is made, and the impact of race making throughout the social order. In many respects, race is itself fundamentally a process of othering, of defining and categorizing people as other. And let me say importantly to this is that defining groups of people as other is obviously not restricted to distinctions based on race. That gender, class, sexuality, religion, culture, language, nationality, age, all these things, among other perceived differences, are frequently invoked to justify structures of inequality, differential treatment, subordinate status, and in some cases, violent conflict and war. Classifying people by different perceived attributes is really a universal phenomenon. And as social beings, we often utilize forms of classification to navigate in our social world, to quickly discern who might be friend or foe, and to provide clues that really guide our social interactions with individuals and the groups we encounter. That said, we also argue that race and racism are flexible, contested, and unstable concepts. The very act of defining racial groups is a process fraught with confusion, contradiction, and unintended consequences. Any definition can prove to be ephemeral as supposed boundaries shift, as slippages occur, as realignments become evident, as in fact new collectivities emerge. Government definitions, for example, have varied widely across time and space. In the early 20th century America, it was really possible, for example, to change one's race simply by crossing state lines. And historical shifts in scientific knowledge in fields ranging from physical anthropology to the genomic sciences have fueled continuing debates about what race may or may not mean as an indicator of human variation. And while such debates and reformulations regarding the concept of race initially occur in specific institutional arenas, public spaces, or academic fields, their consequences are often very dramatic and reverberate throughout society. Lastly, what we've done in racial formation is really to emphasize the trajectory of racial politics. I'm not going to speak much on this, but to say that historically in the United States, we can track rising and declining phases, respectively, of insurgency and of oppression. So, what's new in the new edition? There's a few key themes. Among other things, we advanced the notion of race as a master category. I'll explain all these, most of them in fact. The continuing instability of the race concept itself. Focus a lot on looking at the ideology of colorblindness and why it has proved to be so enduring and hegemonic in our current period. There's also an emphasis on the racialized body to look at the corporeal dimensions of race. And lastly, we talk about, which I won't cover so much, but we could talk about in discussion as well, is to look at neoliberalism as not only an economic project, but as a racial one as well. Now, this first thing I want to carefully emphasize, the notion of race as a master category. And I mention this because I can very easily be misread and misconstrued as to what I'm saying here. What we're trying to say in this new reformulation of this is to say that race in the United States, here I want to be clear about its national implications. Race has historically served as a kind of template, if you will, of both difference and inequality. And by that we mean that the establishment and reproduction of different forms of stratification and difference, of different regimes of domination, inequality, and difference in the United States, have consciously drawn upon concepts based on race. Right? Is to say that race, including the kind of genocide directed against the indigenous populations, as well as racially based slavery, had an inordinate impact on looking at other forms of stratification and difference in the United States. including how class was thought about, who was free, who was unfree, who could own property, who couldn't own property, who could accumulate wealth, who couldn't accumulate wealth. It has a profound effect on how we even look at class, or what we mean by class in the United States. Now, in saying this, it's not to suggest that race is somehow a transcendent category, something that stands above and apart, as it says here, from other areas of stratification and difference. It is to say that, in fact, we certainly believe in intersectionality and the notions that there are multiple and overlapping forms of stratification and difference which are complexly interwoven and connected. That notions of gender and sexuality have had a profound effect on what we mean by race and understanding racial categories. But it is to say somehow that there has been this way in which race has served as a fundamental organizing principle of social life in the United States. In saying that, we also want to say that while racism has served as a template for subordination and oppression, it's really also served as a template for resistance to domination and exploitation. That movements directed, second wave of feminism, for example, or in fact other forms of the anti-war movement, ecological movements, have taken much of their cues from some of the struggles around race and racism in the United States. Now, moving on, one of the other themes in the new edition of Racial Formation is to really talk about the continuing instability of the race concept itself. A nice place to start from, which wasn't available to us when we were writing, is the case of Rachel Dolezal. As you may recall, this past summer, both the news and social media were fascinated and absorbed by the case of Rachel Dolezal, the 37-year-old president of the Spokane chapter of the NAACP, and an Eastern Washington University instructor in African American studies, who claimed for years that she was black. Now, Dolezal herself said that she believes that, here's a quote, challenging the construct of race is at the core of evolving human consciousness. End of quote. Very interesting. It might also be interesting to know in the current edition of Vanity Fair that singer-songwriter Rhiannon weighs in support of Dolezal and calls her a hero for shaking things up racially. Now, regardless of how you might imagine or regard Rachel Dolezal, either as what she says, a transracial individual, or as a white person masquerading as black, one thing is clear. Debates about the system of racial classification remain ongoing and unsettled in a supposedly post-racial era. First of all, are the ongoing debates regarding state-based forms of racial classification. And nowhere is this more apparent than some of the debates about the census and individual and collective identities. It really reflects on the ambiguousness of the categories many of us use for our own research agendas. This is, in fact, I'll just spend just briefly on this. This is from Census 2010, our last census, and these are the two questions. We only ask 10 questions on the census now, since we've abandoned the long form, and two of those questions are about race and ethnicity. And you may recall how you responded to this in 2010 as well. It asks a question here on ethnicity, and it's really an ethnic question. It's really the only ethnic group that the feds are interested in, whether one is Latino, Hispanic, or not. And then there's a kind of racial category. What is this person's race? And you see here white, black, and then here groups of Asians, and over here groups of Pacific Islanders. And then there's some other race category, which the Census Bureau hates, along with the Office of Management Budget, because it muddies the data, so to speak. Well, what's some of the problems with this? Since 1980, nearly 40%, or sometimes over 40%, of the Latino population in the United States has filled out the census wrong. Now, what does it mean to fill it out wrong is one question. It also is like, if 40% of the people are filling it out wrong, there must be something wrong with the question, but that hasn't jarred some of the people behind these kinds of data. What does this mean? Is that, say you were a dark-skinned Puerto Rican, they'd like you to come here and check, yes, I'm Puerto Rican. Come down here and check off that you're black. Or say you were an extremely light-skinned Argentinian. You would put that, yes, I'm, well, here, other Hispanic, Latino, right, Argentinian, and mark down here you're white. Let me say among my students, too, I'm seeing a lot of Asian students who have spent at least a generation in Latin America, who are coming from Brazil, Peru, Mexico, and they would have to say, yes, I'm Peruvian, and I'm Japanese, or I'm Chinese, or something. People didn't get that, so people skipped the question. Most Latinos skipped the question, over 40%, checked off some of the race, and wrote what they were, and had to get recategorized according to the census-based labels. So in fact, well over 94, I think, percent of Latinos wrote something in here. In other words, I'm sorry, I don't mean to confuse you. What happened was that nearly 40% didn't fill it out this way, answer both questions. They just came down here. And that about 94% of people who filled this out were in fact Latino. There's a funny story to this. I was at the Census Bureau a couple of years ago. And would anybody like to guess what the second most popular designator was that people wrote in under some of the race? It was humans. That's a good bet. It's actually Jedi. So as we come up to the reboot of the Star Wars thing, I think that's. I think maybe we'll get more responses. Okay. But there's also other questions we have going on with this. For example, in the last 2010 census, groups of Iranians who are now seen as being white wanted a separate campaign to get detailed data on Iranians and urge people to don't check white, come down here and write down that you're Iranian. We've also had new groups, such as under different acronyms, such as AMEMSA, which stand for Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian, as a kind of newly formed racialized category to get some data on. I'll just show you something really briefly before I leave this. I don't need to take so much time on this. The Census has been conducting, the Office of Management Budget, what is called the alternative questionnaire experiments. And they've been using different formats, doing focus group interviews as well as surveys. And this may be, maybe, I could be wrong, but I think we may see this as at the 2020 census. And I hope you know that there's actually been no two censuses in a row that had the same kind of racial categories to them. For you folks that want to do time series data, for data consistency's sake, you're in a lot of trouble. What happens here is that we eliminate the Hispanic, Latino ethnicity category. It becomes a racial category here, but you're allowed to write in what you want to say. Interesting though, it will allow for the first time whites and blacks to more specify who they are. Where in the current census stuff, it's only a single checkoff. And of course, since Census 2000, you can mark more than two. So it allows for multiple responses. Secondly, what I want to say is that the instability of the race concept is really apparent in the wake of the Human Genome Project. And this has been a real important move and that we should pay particular attention to. On June 26, year 2000, then President Bill Clinton and then Prime Minister Tony Blair, flanked by two molecular geneticists, announced that the human genome had been mapped. And I love these quotes from Clinton first here. Clinton says, "I believe that one of the great truths to emerge from this triumphant expedition inside the human genome is that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same." Also, one of the molecular biologists who was flanking this was Craig Venter. And Venter said, "What we've shown is the concept of race has no scientific basis." Now, what's striking about this is that in less than 5 years after this, everybody's going to be talking about race and genetics. Everybody's going to be focusing on that 0.01% of human variation and difference. And it's led to an explosion in biomedical research, different kinds of pharmaceutical-based research, thinking about new kinds of therapies for drug treatment, and so forth. So it moved very rapidly. Geneticists who weren't that much talked about a couple of decades ago are now in the forefront of much of these kinds of discussions. Among other things, let me give you some other examples which speak to the kind of ominous signs that we may be witnessing a reinscription of race as biology. In the field of pharmacogenomics, which is trying to target specific kinds of drug treatment for specific kinds of ailments, we have the introduction by Nitromed of Bidil, which was touted as the first ethnic designer drug to treat African Americans who suffer from congestive heart failure. There's a long and sordid history behind this I won't go into. But nonetheless, what it shows is, doesn't that look like Bill Cosby? No, I don't think it is, but it is. But that's me. Anyway, that concepts and definitions are being deployed to understand genetic susceptibility to certain diseases and receptivity to certain drug treatments, which uses the language and categories of race, sometimes very indiscriminately. Among other things, too, we have ethnic ancestry tests that Oprah Winfrey and Henry Louis Gates Jr., Skip Gates, among others, have helped to inspire this growing popular quest by individuals to find their roots through ostensibly scientific means. I don't know if you've been following this, but this PBS program in particular has been in a lot of trouble because, in fact, they did Ben Affleck, and Ben Affleck was known to have this slave-owning family, and he asked them to take that out of the program, and they did. And then Ben Affleck and Skip Gates got into a lot of trouble because of that. There's been people who have had some really peculiar experiences with, in fact, these kinds of ethnic ancestry tests. The one that was a person that was received a lot of notoriety, as well as a documentary film, which I've actually never seen, was a man, a person who perceived himself to be an African-American man, Wayne Joseph, who was a high school principal in Chino, in California. Now he's a superintendent in his district, who did one of these things from DNA print genomics. Swabbed, took a swab from his mouth, sent it off, and found that he was in complete shock when the test said he was 57% Indo-European, 39% African-American, Native American, 4% East Asian, and 0% African. So with real unintended consequences. My funny story about this is that when they asked his son, he said his immediate response to his dad was, "Dad, you mean for 50 years you've been passing as black?" In other realms, in the field of forensics, for those enamored by numerous CIS spin-offs, we have the promise to be able to determine the physical characteristics of crime suspects from the DNA they leave at crime scenes. This is a particular interesting case here, which some of you may have known about, that in January of this year, the police in Columbia, South Carolina, released this sketch of a possible suspect in a double murder case that was generated by a computer relying solely on DNA found at the scene of the crime. And what it bodes for is what some people think is going to, what some people claim is this expanding field of forensic DNA phenotyping, including obviously the ability to predict skin color as a way to generate these kinds of sketches. They had no suspects absolutely, in this particular double homicide case, and so they relied on this kind of DNA profiling from snapshot. You know what's really disturbing about this is a pretty vague photo, or description. It could certainly be a lot of different people, and you sort of wonder how it could, in police databases, how it could lead into particular forms of racial profiling going forward. In a recent essay in Contemporary Sociology, Dalton Connerly, Jason Fletcher, and Christopher Dawes write about the emergence of Socio-Genomics. They argue, as it says here, that genetic data is pouring into what were once purely social scientific studies, raising old debates about genes and IQ, racial differences, risk profiling, criminal justice, political polarization, and privacy. If sociologists seek to remain relevant to the study of human behavior, we must embrace, not flee, this deluge of data. I say this is very interesting because Dalton Connerly himself is into this Socio-Genomics and really looking at the massive amounts through supercomputing and through the reduction in the cost in genomic data to really suggest, look at issues around healthcare disparities, look around propensity towards violence, a lot of different questions from not only the lens of social economic factors, but also to try to tease out or explain phenomena on the basis of genetic factors. Or more likely to try to say there's some sort of congruence or a confluence rather between social factors and genetic factors in accounting for these kinds of behaviors and outcomes. It's going to be really interesting going forward how that plays out. There's some real concerns about this, particularly among social scientists. This appeal to genetics seems to, embrace this notion that somehow that's hard science, that's real science. And so if you can explain obesity rates on the basis of that, it seems a lot more legitimate, shall I say, than talking about a lot of social economic factors. The notion of colorblindness. I'm going to move towards that. Hopefully be cognizant of my time here. Way back in 1993, my favorite Clinton, and that's funk master George Clinton, urged people to paint the White House black. And in 2008, what certainly was once a hip-hop racial fantasy became a reality. And in the immediate wake of Barack Obama's election, many observers were quick to claim that the United States was now a colorblind, post-racial society. And there is this ways in which the prevailing hegemonic racial ideology is that of colorblindness. Many believe that the goals of the civil rights movement have been substantially achieved, that racial discrimination is now a thing of the past, and that we are rapidly evolving to a colorblind society. And in fact, in some states, there's been really this push to get rid of racial data under the guise that this would promote a colorblind society. In California, we have our own ex-University of California regent. This is Ward Connerly, who is the architect of Proposition 209 as well, California's anti-affirmative action measure, which was successful. This was less successful. He didn't win on this one. But back in 2003, he proposed a amendment to the California Constitution, which would say that California, the state of California, couldn't engage in any forms of racial classification. And you see here, he wrote the thing in the voter guide. Forget the lessons of histories. Classification systems were invented to keep certain groups in their place, deny them rights. In an editorial for the San Francisco Chronicle, he said racial categories give credence to the dangerous view held by many that race is fixed biological reality. And in fact, detached from his Proposition 54, some of us could agree with some of his arguments. Race is not biology. Race has been used as a category for oppression. Of course, what Ward Connerly didn't realize is in the post-civil rights era, those same categories have been utilized to track forms of racial inequality that inform kind of policy interventions to try to deal with those things. Nonetheless, and it's very important here that the reality is without some form of racial record keeping, we're sort of unable to empirically examine institutional patterns of racial inequality with respect to income, wealth, educational opportunity, healthcare, among other important indicators of well-being and life chances. Let me be clear here. This does not mean we can have accurate, precise, and scientific forms of racial classification. Racial categories and the definitions and meanings we impart to them change over time. They cannot, however, simply be dispensed with. In a racially stratified society, concepts of race, social concepts of race, continue to matter. In fact, I want to draw your attention and segue into what I think are some new and interesting trends in racial theory. This is a book by a legal scholar named Obasagi, and it's a recent book called Blinded by Sight. And in many ways, it provides a provocative critique of the basic assumptions that are foundational to the ideology of colorblindness and colorblind jurisprudence. Obasagi, in the social constructionist tradition, questions a fundamental aspect of race epistemology, namely that race is what we see. In sharp contrast to this assumption, he empirically demonstrates that social context and interactions construct the visual significance given to race. And he draws upon interviewed data with 106 respondents who have been blind since birth and asks them to talk about what they think race is and what race means. Right? And in many respects, Blinded by Sight is sort of two books in one. It provides this empirical study of how people who have been blind since birth understand race and racism, and how the concept of race as visually self-evident distorts some of the laws, practices, and policies ostensibly dealing with racial discrimination. Now, Obasagi's book provides a good segue for me to reflect on, as I said, some of these other issues and topics we might consider as we move racial theory forward. One of the things we need to do is think about what's going on, particularly in some of the mind sciences and in social psychology. And particularly I'm thinking here of the implicit bias literature. And implicit bias, as you know, refers to these attitudes and the mental schemas that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And there are diagnostic tests, such as the implicit association test. How many have taken the implicit association? Does anybody take? Oh, a large portion of you have the ITs that can measure not only which group differences are salient, but the meanings and strengths of associations that map onto these group differences. And these associations are automatic and operate below our conscious awareness and radar and are very much beyond our control. In fact, from the mind sciences, there was a neuroimaging study by Lasana Harris and Susan Fisk that found that images of persons belonging to specific marginalized groups, outgroups, did not, even when shown to respondents, even trigger recognition at the neural level as being human. So there's groups that are so seen as outsiders, as other, but they don't even trigger recognition at the neural level as being somehow human. Now, what I want to say about this is that it's important that this literature gets integrated with some of the more structural theories around race and racism. And so far, that dialogue has not really occurred. It's been tentative, but there hasn't been this kind of serious engagement between them. So we need to specify and think about the relationship between these unconscious mental schemas and the institutionalization of practices that unequally allocate resources in different social structures and settings. And going forward, we need to see that there's a relationship between the collective mind and social structures as somehow a constitutive process, not a causal one, but one that is highly interactive and works together to produce certain forms of racial disadvantage, racial outcomes. We also need to think about moving towards a more relational approach to the study of race and ethnicity in both the United States and globally. And here, I use the term relational as opposed to comparative. A comparative approach to the study of different racial ethnic groups often fails to recognize that racialization itself is a mutually constitutive experience. It's a relational process. And in a new book, historian Natalia Molina illustrates how the racial category of Mexican has been constructed, situated, and hierarchically positioned in relationship to other groups of color in the United States. Molina focuses on what she calls racial scripts to highlight the connections among racialized groups across time and place. And Melina notes, in quoting her, that once attitudes, practices, customs, policies, and laws are directed at one group, they become readily available and hence easily applied to other groups. So in fact, racial scripts are transferable. And it's important to note that while such scripts are usually imposed from above by dominant institutions and social actors, racialized groups themselves often advance their own scripts, counter-scripts, that enable seemingly unlikely alliances and expressions, sometimes, of solidarity among different groups. There's also some interesting work that's coming up about this relationality with respect to the prevailing black-white paradigm of race, and also to think about issues of indigeneity and settler colonialism. And I mentioned this because I wanted to share actually a quote, something that really struck me. In March this past year at UC Berkeley, Angela Davis gave a talk, and Angela Davis was actually ruminating on issues around incarceration and other things. But at one moment in her talk, she said something that was very interesting. She talked about the black demand after the Civil War for land and the means to work the land in the immediate aftermath of slavery. But she said that in order, to talk about the demands being made during Reconstruction, I wanted to put that in conversation with what does that mean for people who are concerned about settler colonialism and indigeneity and genocide. And I'll just give you, I actually got a copy of the talk, so I'll quote you what she said, because the demand, as many of you know, was for 40 acres and a mule. She says, "But 40 acres and a mule, did we ever stop to think about the fact that though Africans were brought to this hemisphere as slaves, this does not absolve people of African descent of the responsibility of thinking about and acting on settler colonialism?" She says, "And so when we say 40 acres and a mule, we have to ask, whose land was that? It means we have to rethink the whole history of our struggle for freedom in order to take into account that the enslavement of people of African descent on Native American land meant that people of African descent were also implicated in that colonialism." End of quote. That's a very interesting statement in terms of how we understand, as she says, our collective struggle for freedom, how other groups are implicated, and how we, in some ways too, become implicated in the oppression of others, which I think is very important going forward. And very important for us to think about, as I said, the relational character of race and racism in the United States. Now, another group of literature that is doing this, I think, is literature that focuses on how race travels. They also employ a relational approach that's highly suggestive for future theoretical inquiry. In Imperial Citizens, a book by Nadia Kim, looks at the global hegemonic reach of U.S. racial ideology in South Korea and how that informs what the experiences and racial understandings that South Korean immigrants have when they come to the United States. So her point here is that the impact, particularly of the U.S. military presence since the Korean conflict in South Korea, has helped to shape certain kinds of racial understandings in South Korea. And the people who migrate from South Korea bring some of those understandings here and have to reconstitute them or rethink them in the case of being in LA or other places of settlement. Another book which I find really interesting is Wendy Roth's recent book, In Race Migrations. She talks about how race and ethnicity is really continually refashioned in a transnational space. And this is really interesting. Her focus is on looking at people from the Dominican Republic and people from Puerto Rico who settle in the United States, but also what people in Puerto Rico and the Dominican public think about race. And she argues it's not a one-way street, that in fact migrants to the United States send back messages about racial categories and meanings that help reshape what people in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic think about race, and then it's a cycle, in other words. It's a continuous feedback loop, if you will, about what race and racism means in the United States. Very interesting. Among other things, which is quite striking, which you could go into some of the factors, is that people who are phenotypically the same. She uses a lot around photographs and about people placing people in certain racial frames. That phenotypically similar Dominicans and Puerto Ricans in the United States, that Dominicans are 20% more likely to claim themselves to be black than Puerto Ricans do. And that raises some interesting issues about citizenship and feelings of social belonging among Puerto Ricans here in the United States. The point is that migrants sort of maintain, they adopt, they strategically utilize different racial schema. Here again, racial schemas come to the fore in different ways, in a constant reference to both their countries of origin and those of settlement. All right, let me get my last point here, and that is that increasingly we're told we're moving towards a majority-minority society. And the point is that what's racial hierarchy, what's racial stratification in the United States going to look like as we move towards this majority-minority society? And a looming question is how different racialized groups will be situated in position and who will be doing the positioning. This is from Eduardo Bonilla Silva, but different scenarios have been advanced by different social theorists. George Yancey has an emerging sort of black, non-black divide in which he says Asian Americans and Latinos are going to be drawn into sort of the white side of the color line, and that blacks will face an enduring form of racial alienation. Eduardo Bonilla Silva has posed, as many of you know, a kind of tri-racial order of whites, honorary whites, and what he calls a collective black. And here you can see it's broken down into different kinds of ethnic groups where groups could be potentially positioned in this tri-racial hierarchy. Now, each scenario envisions a different organizing principle of social stratification, one that defines group boundaries, shapes groups' consciousness, and establishes the overall structure of power and privilege. And what each scenario gives us in many respects is a glimpse of what the prevailing racial order might look like and how groups will be situated within such a racialized hierarchy. Now, while we can debate the possibility and relative merits of each scenario, one thing seems clear to me, that the emergence of a majority-minority society does not imply the diminishment of white supremacist ideology, nor does it imply a fundamental restructuring of white racial dominance. And despite the prevailing ideology of colorblindness, calls to get beyond race, and that we are now a post-racial society, race still matters, and it matters more than ever. I think I've listed too many things to neatly tie together, so I'm going to end here, and thanks for being such an attentive audience.